What's going on, everyone? Back again with part 2 of the ARP head stud install. If you didn't watch the first video, then it doesn't really make sense. Why are you here? Go watch that one. At the end of my last video, I was explaining that off camera, I got my right head on and I left all my buckets in the same place, just like I said, but then I went to set my valve lash and my valve lash was actually too tight. So I found out the engine shop that built my engine actually set my valve lash a little bit too tight and I want to correct that. So I'm going to be showing you guys how to do that in this video. So what I did, just so I know where each bucket was I numbered them on each head, 1 to 8 on one head and 9 to 16 on the other head. So like you can see on my messy sheet of paper here, I numbered front to back 1, 2, 3, 4 on the intake, and then 5, 6, 7, 8 on the exhaust. I also marked the size of each bucket next to each number. So if you look inside your bucket, you can actually see a number inside of there. It says 502. All that number is 5.02 millimeters from this point that contacts your valve to the top of the bucket, which contacts your cam lobe. So pretty much the smaller number, the more clearance you're gonna have, and then the bigger number, the less clearance you're gonna have. Before I get too heavy into talking valve lash numbers though, I'm gonna get the head cleaned up and get it bolted up to the block. First thing I'm gonna get cleaned up is the top portion of the head and the cam plate. Just take a razor blade and clean off all the big silicone that's sitting there. And then just like in the last couple of videos that I've been doing, just take a piece of Scotch-Brite and kind of clean up the rest of the surface and then get brake clean in a rag and wipe it down so it's nice and clean. Same with the cam plate.
Darling, you send me. I know you send me. Darling, you send me. I know you send me. Honest to do. Send me. Honest to do.
All right, now that I got the top of the head cleaned up and the cam plate cleaned up, I'm gonna go ahead and clean the bottom of the head that mates to the block. If you guys are doing this, go ahead and take your heads to a machine shop and get them resurfaced. The only reason I'm not resurfacing mine is because I just got them resurfaced like 30,000 K ago, so I'm just gonna put them back on the way they are. I'm not gonna show me cleaning up the bottom of the head because if you guys are doing this, you're probably getting them resurfaced anyways. Once you get your head back from the machine shop or you cleaned it like me, she's gonna be all nice and clean like this. And the bottom should be nice and clean, ready to go to a fresh new head gasket. Before I get my new head gasket on, I'm gonna spray some brake clean on a rag and wipe off the block again.
I know you do. Send me.
Now that I got the block cleaned up and I got the cylinder walls wiped down, I'm gonna slap some assembly lube on the inside of the cylinders. I'm gonna set my new head gasket on. The head gasket only goes on one way. Make sure all your coolant passages and oil passages line up and make sure you're seated 100% properly on the dowel pins. I'm gonna do this before I put the head on. ARP supplies you with this thread lube. You just gotta put it on the threads on the end of every one of the studs. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and wipe down my head one more time. It's the head twice. After you wipe the bottom up, make sure that you go in and wipe down all of your surfaces that the washers are going to be sitting on for the head, just to make sure there's no oil or anything like that on those. I'm going to need some finesse here because I put the studs on before the head, but we're going to slide the head over the studs onto the block. Like a glove. Now take all 6 of your washers and completely wipe them down. Make sure there's absolutely no oil on these. Once you get them cleaned up, you're gonna go ahead and set each one on each stud. Now you're gonna wipe your nuts down. Then you're gonna put a little bit more of this assembly lube just on the bottom face of the nut. Then you're gonna go ahead and thread each nut onto each stud. Now you're gonna go ahead and just snug up each nut. I'll show you guys the torque sequence that they give you here. You're gonna do 3 passes. You're gonna do 30 foot-pounds the first time, 60 foot-pounds the second time, and then 90 the third time. I'm gonna sing down under the water. Okay, now that I got my head bolted up, I'm gonna start setting my valve lash. I think these buckets are like 25 bucks a piece or 20 bucks a piece from Subaru. So to save you on buying 16 buckets at 20 bucks a piece, I'm gonna show you guys how to move around the buckets that you already have to get each cam into spec. So if your guys' buckets are all in the same spot as they were when you took it apart, go ahead and bolt your cam plate up and bolt your cam caps up and torque all the bolts to spec, then take your measurements. Once you get all your measurements for each one, just write down a list front to back for each cam so that you have your numbers. Then unbolt your cam plate and unbolt your cam caps, take your cams out, and then check each bucket that was in each spot and mark with a paint pen on the top of the bucket, just like I did here, just so that you know what size bucket was on each cam lobe. And like I said before, the bigger number of bucket you have, the less clearance you're gonna have. So if you look at my measurements for my left cylinder head here, I was at 4 thou at the front cam lobe, 5 thou, and then 6 thou, and then 8 thou. And I was using bucket number 9, 10, 11, and 12. 9 was a 502, 10 was a 502, 11 was a 502, and 12 was a 503. So now I know that I have less clearance with a 502. I can put a smaller bucket in there and increase my clearance between the bucket and the cam lobe. So what I did, since I didn't have enough clearance here and my lash was too tight, was I took out the 502s and then I put in a 495, a 497, and a 499 because those were the smallest buckets that I had. So that brought my spec up to 6 thou, 6 thou, 6.5 thou, and 8 thou, which is all within your spec of 5.5 thou to 8 thou. Then I did the same thing with my exhaust cam. My exhaust cam was actually in spec. They were all 13 and 12 thou, and the spec is 11.8 to 15.8 thou, so they're on the tighter side. So I just wanted to increase it just a little bit if I could. So I moved a little bit smaller buckets in just to increase my lash a little bit. I got it to 13, 12.5, 12.5, and 13. So I switched it to a 498, a 497, and a 495. This valve, I left the same bucket in there because that was the biggest one that I have, and it kept my spec at 13 thou. So now that you guys know what I did to move around buckets and get the right clearance, I'm gonna show you guys how I actually measured that clearance. First thing you're gonna do is get both your intake and exhaust cams on there and set your cam plate and your cam caps just on top. So I forgot to mention this before I put the cam plate on, but don't put silicone on your cam plate yet. Just for when you're doing your measurements, you wanna leave it dry, just because then you're not gonna be cleaning silicone off all the time when you're taking it off and putting it back on, getting different measurements. So put it on dry for now. So all I did was just ram these bolts until I stopped an impact. I didn't torque them or anything yet. You're gonna torque the 8 back 10 mil bolts on the cam caps in the back of the cam plate to 14.8 foot-pounds. And then the 4 on the front are gonna be 7.2 foot-pounds. Now that you got them torqued up, just grab each cam and make sure you can spin each one freely. Now you're gonna grab a set of feeler gauges. If you don't have any, I'm sure you can pick up a set for like 10 bucks or 15 bucks from your local auto parts store. On your feeler gauge, there's gonna be different measurements. This one says 5 thou or 0.127 millimeters. So what you're gonna do to measure your lash is make sure your cams turn so that you are measuring the clearance between the base of your lobe and your bucket. So if I take a 5 thou feeler blade and shove it in there, it should go in nice and easy. That means I have more than 5 thou. You'll also feel a little bit of drag on it to know when it's getting tighter. So now since I went over every cam with 5 thou, I'm gonna go up to the 6 thou feeler blade. And if it doesn't fit at the start, if you turn your cam a little bit and it goes in and then get it back to the base, and if you can pull it in and out, that's your true measurement. So this one is 6 thou. So this cam's at 6 thou. Now on this cam, again, same thing, it won't go on. But if I turn it, I could still pull it freely and I could still rotate the cam with the feeler blade in there. So both those guys are gonna be 6. Now I'm gonna rotate it to the base on this one. Now 6 fits no problem on that one, and 6 fits no problem on that one. So now since they fit no problem there, I'm gonna go up to a 7 thou feeler blade. I'm gonna start at the back and it fits there, no problem. Here it doesn't fit. If I rotate the cam and try and get it in, it won't fit at all. So I'm gonna say, since this one was a little bit loose on 6, I'm gonna say that one's 6.5. These two are 6, and then this back one, 7 goes in easy. So let's go up to an 8. So I'm going with an 8 thou feeler blade, and it doesn't fit either, even if I don't turn my cam. So I'm not at 8 thou on that back one, actually. I thought I was last time, but maybe not. Now I take my 7, goes in easy. So I'm gonna say this one's at about 7.5. This one's at about 6.5. This one's 6, and this one's also 6. Now moving on to my exhaust side, since I know the max spec is 15 thou, we're gonna start there with a 15 thou feeler blade. Again, turn your cam to the base of the lobe. Won't go in, won't go in, won't go in, and won't go in. Now we jump up to the next size, which is 14 thou. Doesn't fit, doesn't fit, doesn't fit, and doesn't fit. Now up to the next size smaller, which is a 13. So I turned my cam and I got my 13 in there and I could pull it in and out. It's tight, but that's probably the actual true spec of that cam. It might be a 12.5, but if you can get a 13 in there and you can pull it in and out, I'm gonna call that a 13. Doesn't fit, and it fits nice and tight in that one. And I can still turn the cam with it on, and this one, I can also still turn the cam with it under. So now that we know that 13 was tight in these ones and 14 didn't fit, we're gonna call these ones 13 because they were nice and tight. Now let's get our measurements for these two inside cam lobes. So since 13 didn't fit, we're now gonna go down to a 12th thou, which fits, and I can turn the cam lobe. That also fits, and I can turn the cam lobe. So since the 12th thou feeler blade goes in pretty easy, we're gonna call that about 12.5 thou, since 13 didn't fit, but 12th thou goes in easy. Now that you know your valve lash is within spec, go ahead and take everything back off your cams, your cam caps, and your cam plate. Then go and clean all your numbers you wrote off of your buckets, clean everything again, just give it a good wipe down, make sure everything's squeaky clean. Also give your cam plate and your cam caps and cams a good wipe down, make sure those are super clean. Now I'm gonna take some assembly lube everything up on the head and get my cams back on. Now that everything's lubed up and my sealing surfaces are clean, I'm gonna go ahead and seal up my cam plate and get that on. There we go, now I got the cam plate on and I got the cam caps on. I'll show you guys on my phone real quick the torque sequence of the bolts. These back gate bolts are all gonna be 14.8 foot-pounds. Those are gonna be 7.2 foot-pounds. Go very, very light on the silicone when you're sealing your cam plate. You don't wanna put too much on because if you look in where your cam seal sits, a bunch of that silicone will just protrude out into here and then your cam seal will end up leaking. So I put a little bit too much on. It was coming out into here, so I just took a rag and wiped all the silicone out that got into my cam sealing area. Once everything's all in, give your cams another spin by hand. Make sure you can spin those freely. Now you're gonna grab your feeler blades again and just double check your valve lash one more time. All my valve lash measurements ended up being the same. The 6th thou on the front two actually went in a little bit easier now just because of the added gap from the silicone a little bit, I think. So now that that's all good, I double checked my valve lash measurements, everything checked out the same. I'm gonna head over to the Varsol tank and get my valve cover cleaned up and ready to get back on. Now I got my OEM Valve Cover Gasket and 2 OEM Spark Plug tube seals in there. I always recommend using OEM gaskets. They seal the best. The aftermarket ones can leak sometimes. I put a Malhi gasket kit in last time I had my engine out, and as soon as I fired it up, my valve cover gaskets were sweating, so use OEM shit. Before you go, just slap your valve cover on there. There's actually 2 points on the head that you have to silicone just around the cam plate and where the cam plate meets the block, just because they're known to leak where the cam plate meets the head. Right in those little spots there and right there. There we go, silicone's on. Now let's slap that valve cover on. There we go, valve cover's all torqued up. She's starting to look like an engine again. I torqued all the valve cover bolts at 5 foot-pounds because that's the lowest my torque wrench goes. The actual torque is 4.7 if you guys want to do that. There's your torque sequence. Now let's get my cam seals in. I like to take a little bit of Vaseline and just lube up the cam seal. Okay, so they tell you need a special service tool to put these cam seals in, but who buys special service tools? The way that I do this is I just get them all lubed up with Vaseline, get it set in there, and then just push them in as much as you can with your fingers. Now take a hammer and a little 3/8 drive extension and just slowly tap it in. There we go, both cam seals are in. If you actually feel around with your finger, the cam seals should be level with the face of the cam plate. So just to show how I was doing this when I was using this extension, is I would set it up so that the extension is half on the seal and half on the cam plate. That way you drive it so it's perfectly even with the cam plate or the head. Now I'm gonna get my new Iridium Spark Plugs in and get my coil packs bolted back up. Now I'm gonna set the valve lash on the other head. So what I did was I took all the buckets that I had left over after I got the other head into spec, and then I just put them all randomly into this head just so that I could take measurements with those ones in and see how much clearance I have with those. Then you can take your measurements and do the math to figure out the right size bucket you need. So here's my measurements on my exhaust and my intake here. Just like before, I was moving around buckets like crazy, trying to get as many as I could into spec so I didn't have to buy that many buckets. So I ended up getting 3 of them into spec. I got 2 on the exhaust side that were at 13 thou, and on my intake side, I got 1 at 7 thou. The rest of them I had to replace. Because if you look here, I was at 3 thou, 2 thou, and 4 thou, and that's too tight. On my exhaust, I was at 8 thou and 7 thou on the other 2, so I needed to get more clearance on those too. So just so that you guys can see how I did the math, what I did was I wrote down my bucket size that was on that valve, and then I wrote down my clearance that I had at that valve in inches and what that's equal to in millimeters. So 8 inches is equal to 0.203 millimeters. Then I also wrote down what clearance I want, which I want 13 thou on my exhaust side, which is equal to 0.330 millimeters. Then I took the clearance that I want, which is 0.330 millimeters or 13 thou, and I subtracted it by the clearance that I actually have, which is 0.203 millimeters or 8 thou. That number now gives me the clearance that I need to add to that valve, which is 0.127 millimeters. So now I took my bucket that I currently have in there, which is a 502, which is equal to 5.02 millimeters, and I subtracted the clearance that I want because I need to put a smaller bucket in to get to the clearance that I want. So that's subtracting 0.127 millimeters from 5.02 millimeters, and that comes out to 4.893 millimeters. So this number is gonna be the bucket size that you need. Since that's a 4.893, it's a little bit above 489, so I decided to go with a 489 bucket. Because if I were to go with a 490, then I'd be a little bit tighter, and I want to be on the looser end because 13 thou is already closer to the bottom of the spec than at the top. So I hope that shit makes sense to you guys. I know it was a little bit confusing for me when I first started, but then after you get into it and you start doing the math, it actually makes sense and it's super simple. I did the same math on every other valve that I needed to add clearance to, and that gave me all my numbers. So I needed 3 489s, a 483, and a 496. So I reached out to Vex Performance here in Calgary, and they were able to get me the buckets that I needed. So here they are. They sent me 3 489s, a 496, and they actually didn't have a 483, so they just sent me a 482. Which I'm hoping is gonna be okay, because if you look at my math for that valve, it actually came out to me needing a 4.838 sized bucket, which is closer to 484, and that's supposed to get me to 7 thou. So I'm hoping putting a 482 in there is gonna keep me between that 7 to 8 thou range. So now that I know what size bucket I need on each valve, I'm gonna get it all slapped together. I'm not gonna show you guys in detail how to do this side again, because it's the exact same thing as the other side. So I'm gonna just run a time lapse of me doing this. So this is one of the oil feed line Banjo bolts. You can see that little filter inside there. Yeah. Take that shit out. Don't run those filters in these Banjo bolts. Mine's actually pretty clear, but I've seen so many of these fill with shit and clog up, and they cause you way too many issues, so get rid of them. All right, this is like 2 weeks later. I had to run to Subaru and grab some more parts. And this video is getting like way too long anyways. So all I did was I went through all my oil feed lines, took out all the Banjo bolts, and any of the Banjo bolts that had filters in them, I took them out, just like in the clip that you saw just before this. Now all I'm gonna do to finish this video off is I'm gonna take all the oil feed lines off, take the Banjo bolts out, get new crush washers on them, and torque them up. So I'm not counting crush washers for the oil feed line that goes to your turbo, because I'm probably gonna be relocating this because I'm going rotated. But I'm gonna be replacing the crush washers on this Banjo bolt on the oil control valve, this Banjo bolt that bolts to the head here, this Banjo bolt that bolts to the head here, here, and then another one on the oil control valve on the other head. And then there's another one on the back of your head here that's got 2 crush washers on it. Just to show you guys, on each one of these bolts, there's a crush washer that sits on the top of the line and then one that sits on the bottom of the line. So in total, you're gonna need 10 crush washers for just the engine side of things. Every one of the Banjo bolts gets torqued to 21.4 foot-pounds. So I'm not actually gonna replace the 2 crush washers on the back of the head just because I don't know where I'm gonna be getting oil from to feed my turbo yet. I decided to pull off my crank gear just to check and see if that front main was sweating at all. And I noticed that it's not actually an OEM seal in there and it's starting to sweat a little bit, so I'm gonna replace it while I'm at it. The OEM seals should have this brown color just like my cam seals here. So in my next video, I'm gonna be showing you guys how to set your timing, how to get your timing belt back on, how to get everything reassembled on the front side of the engine. So with all that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next video. I hope this video helped you guys out. Peace out. Thanks for watching.